how many of my students who just studied Hamlet with me will pick up Don Quixote the novel, and they'll point out to themselves how, wow, so much of what was Shakespeare was messing around with in Hamlet plays around. Again, we said they were contemporaries, right? He says in chapter 11, Don Quixote says, though, knights are no longer legit knights because there's this thing, gunpowder and fighting, and you know, the whole thing of honor, it's all gone away. Modernity, in other words, is somehow ruining everything. Chapter 12, we get the famous African story about three brothers who the father gives them the opportunity to grow up and go away. One to religion, one to business, one to war. That's this guy. He gets captured by the Turks, sounding very much like Cervantes himself. By chapter 13, you have the lovely Zorenda, who you're introduced to, another love story. By chapter 14, you've got the two of them escaping to Spain. And then all of a sudden, here they are at the end. By chapter 15, we got a judge who arrives, who just happens to be the brother. So we have all these kind of, you know, coincidences that can't be legit coincidences. By chapter 16, we have a singing donkey boy that shows up, okay, and he is in love with Clara. Don Quixote is tricked into hanging by his wrists outside of the castle inn. And in other words, people start having a good time with Don Quixote. By chapter 17, the horsemen are looking for the young donkey boy, Don Luis. The barber shows up and wants his basin back from Don Quixote. So in other words, Cervantes at the end starts to bring all these different strands of thread of storytelling together. By chapter 19, Don Quixote's put in a cage by the curate and the barber, and they're going to take him back. It's a magic vehicle, of course. Don Quixote will always interpret anything that happens in the best of all lights. He's like Pangloss in Voltaire's Candide. By chapter 20, Don Quixote knows he's being carried now in his special carriage off to his girl. Of course, they're taking him home. By chapter 21, a religious man rides along, and they have this interesting conversation about books and in the interpretation of books, hermeneutics, and the notion of reading only moral books, sounding very much like Plato's Republic, when Plato begins to make the same arguments. By chapter 22, Don Quixote and the religious canon debate, are knights errant stories really true? And by chapter 23, they meet again a goat herder who, guess what, has a story to tell. This is Eugenio's story about lost love. And then by chapter 25, at the end of the first part, Don Quixote and Eugenio will fight, and Sancho Panza gets beat up too, and ultimately will return them back to their village. The end of the first part and the Harvard Classics volume. However, there's 74 chapters of part 2. I can't go through all of that, published in 1615. There's always been a debate. In the intro material for Harvard Classics, the writer will say, Dr. Eliot will say, that the first part of Don Quixote, the novel, is far superior to the second part. Today, most scholars will argue the reverse, and that in fact the second part is way more better organized than the like. Now what happened is that apparently another person published some stories about Don Quixote, and it was really bad, and it kind of forced Cervantes to have to come back and write the second part of this novel. It's interesting the way it starts, though. Sancho Panza will tell Don Quixote, dude, you're famous. In other words, this is a study about celebrity and what it means. Again, Don Quixote will go in search of his Dulcinea, and when finally we meet her, she's less than attractive. And yet, this is because some wizard made her less than attractive, right? They meet some actors. They get into this interesting fight with the actors. They meet the Knight of the Mirror, the Knight of the Woods, and Don Quixote has these contests. I mentioned already the famous fighting of the lion. It's one of the famous moments in the second part where he wants to fight this lion in a cage. He says, open the door, I'm ready to have a fight. They open the door and the lion just sits there. And he goes, come out and fight me. And the lion just sits there and yawns at him. But the interesting debate about this story is, you know, Don Quixote was ready to fight a lion. That proves he's pretty brave, right? Well, yeah, but the lion didn't fight him. What difference does it make? As long as he showed his courage and intending to fight, the lion. We have an interesting adventure of Montesino's cave where they drop him down. It's kind of like time travel. It's a fascinating little story. Don Quixote next will jack a puppet show. This takes us back to the first part and some of the released criminals. And one of them has an ape that allows him to tell the future. And Don Quixote sees his puppet show and he just starts slashing at all of the puppets. But the difference now in the second part is that all of a sudden Don Quixote starts to realize that it wasn't real. That in fact it was, oh man, I jacked up a puppet show. And this is kind of the tragic part of the end of the novel. Then we have this interesting exchange, a series of stories with Don Quixote and the Duke and the Duchess. They have a bit of fun both with him and with Sancho Panza as well. Sancho Panza, through this process, gets his island, even though it's not legit. But he gets his island, and he gets to be governor of the island. And it's fascinating the way in which Sancho Panza is a really, really good governor. And it's interesting the ways in which Don Quixote will give great advice to Sancho Panza about making sure that he takes care of the poor, of the hurt, of the disenfranchised. Ultimately, though, Sancho Panza will have to say, after he's been governor for a few days, I really don't want to be a governor, I'd rather be a squire with you. Ultimately, the novel will end with Don Quixote going back home. He does several things. He renounces his life as a knight-errant. He wills all of his stuff to Sancho Panza. And it's at this point, Sancho Panza, it's kind of a compelling final scene. Sancho Panza wants to argue that, no, you're not dying. And it's pretty obvious that he is. In other words, notice that the idealism, the dreamy idealism of Don Quixote by the end of the novel becomes Sancho Panza's as well. Well, this is brilliantly fun stuff. Let's just really quickly now work level 2 and 3. At 2A, well, obviously a whole lot of potential messages, themes here. One of them is, can literature serve as a basis for understanding reality? Or is it rather the opposite? The idea that things are not always what they seem is central to the reading of this text. But the other important message is, sometimes it's better to be an idealist than it is to be a realist when you got to get through painful experiences. At level 2B, well, the symbolism is self-evident. Sancho Panza, he represents the empirical, doesn't he? The commonsensical, that is to say, reality. Don Quixote represents the imagination. And we're reminded, right, of that famous line of Albert Einstein, imagination is more important than knowledge. Don Quixote would certainly agree with that one as well. The question, of course, is, while imagination can help one get through life better, happier, is it possible even maybe more moral? Is it the right thing to do? The tension that is clear in Shakespeare, in our study of Shakespeare, is also clear in Cervantes. This tension between the new burgeoning technologies and the Renaissance itself, and the old ways of doing things. Well, at 3A, for those of us who have enjoyed Thurber's Secret Life of Walter Mitty, we know where now it came from. We've got, you'll remember Dickinson's little "much madness is divinest sense to the discerning eye." The whole idea that it all depends upon the majority who gets to decide what's sane or what's insane. Obviously, we can't read a text like this without appreciating all the epics that came before. The Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, obviously Inferno comes to mind as well, as texts that are going to be sacred within the Western tradition, and yet Cervantes will kind of, he'll kind of laugh off all of it. It's a fun read, Cervantes Don Quixote. It's a fun read to read after you've read and closely studied all of the other serious epics. By the way, this mock epic approach, though, happens quite a bit. Pope's Rape of the Lock comes to mind as one more attempt to make fun of the great epic tradition. Finally, at 3B, and how can we relate this information to ourselves? Do you think, I realize I'm asking a group of students that you guys read lots and lots, but do you think you can read too many books? You'll maybe remember in the comments that we made about Francis Bacon's Essay of Studies that he said only a few books are to actually be read, swallowed, digested seriously. All the others you can just kind of taste. What are your thoughts about this? Can you read too many books? Can you have too many ideas? You know that old saying that you can engage so many ideas that you don't even know what you believe anymore, a la, Don Quixote. How about this question? Is Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, they obviously are funny, they're comic, but are they also tragic in some ways to you, right? All kinds of terrible things happen to them, they bring it on themselves in some way. How about this one? If you could go back to an earlier time that was much simpler, maybe we would say, right? Pre-modern, we might even say. Would that be a good thing, or would that be for you, quintessentially boring? Because the one thing we can say about Don Quixote is whatever happens, his life isn't boring. Well, quickly, there's your outline of Cervantes Don Quixote. My hope is that we've said enough to interest you in picking the novel up and I hope reading it. We now turn to Harvard Classics volume number 15, and here we're going to get another kind of rendering of the Odyssey, of an adventure story in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, but for very serious reasons, not mock reasons, very serious reasons. And of course, after you've read Cervantes Don Quixote, it does beg the question about reading religious texts, especially religious texts that are supposed to be taken very seriously. I mean, when you pick up and you read the Bhagavad Gita, or for example, you read the Gospel accounts of Jesus Christ, you're not supposed to read them as kind of like comic and jest. Not to say there isn't humor there, but rather these are serious texts. Reading Cervantes Don Quixote will make you kind of maybe second guess that view all the time. But when we pick up Pilgrim's Progress, we're going to see a text that's supposed to be read as allegory and yet taken very seriously. Well, I hope you enjoyed the few comments on Cervantes and Don Quixote. Thank you.